Before we continue today, I want you to know that the reason that I could write books on this subject, the reason that I learned things so that I had something to say about this, is because of the many years that I felt lonely. And when I say I felt lonely, I mean like sometimes cried alone at night, kind of lonely. Wondered if I would ever find the kind of friends that I wanted, kind of lonely. Wondered if I would ever find that place where it was really clear that I belonged. I could talk a lot about that, but I was told I have only 1 hour, so I'm just going to talk about one. In my mid-30s, I went to graduate school at Yale to study religion, philosophy, and ethics. And when I got there, I discovered that the long history of the school and all the fanciness that I've been told about it led me to believe that I would never be good enough to actually belong there. And this is a true story. I walked the halls of my own graduate school genuinely concerned that at any moment an administrator was going to find me in the hall, tap me on the shoulder, and explain that they had discovered a terrible mistake and that I need to leave right away. And I was so convinced this was going to happen, I already knew what I was going to say when this happened. And I went something along the lines of, I know, I wondered what took you so long. And as I experienced this, I reflected on some of the wisdom of some sages I had read and some mentors of mine. And my wife and I started started a dinner series in our home on Friday nights, which is simply a very fancy way of saying that I would go and make an enormous amount of food on Friday night and then invited anybody who wanted to join us for dinner on that evening. And I promise you, in that first year when we were making those dinners in our small home in New Haven, there was a lot of evidence that this was a terrible idea. There was interest in the first couple of weeks because it was novel, but then after that, there were times where I'd make an enormous amount of food, and like 3 people on a campus of 15,000 would come over to share it with me. There were the times where people would tell me that they would join me for that dinner I was going to cook on Friday night, and sometime between that conversation and actual Friday night, they found something far more interesting and fun to do than share a meal with me. And then there were the far more numerous times when I had to turn down any invitation to anything fun or interesting anywhere on campus, or even in New York City, because I was going to make an enormous amount of food for maybe not very many people. But we continued making these dinners, and in time, something extraordinary happened. And that is, they became popular. In fact, they became so popular that I had figured out that in the first 2 years, we had hosted over 500 people, one small dinner at a time in our home over those 2 years. And actually, it had become so onerous to do the shopping and the cooking and the cleaning over those 2 years that my now wife and I couldn't keep up. So at that point, we created a meeting of the regulars to our dinners, who at this point were our friends. And out of that meeting, what came out of it is some of them agreed to be leaders for each dinner, so every week had someone leading that dinner. Others agreed to be volunteers to support that leader to make sure that dinner was hosted. And then Arjan handled the wait lists because more people wanted to share dinner with us than we had space. And Sam handled the sponsors, because it turned out that not all the undergrads who wanted to make a meal for strangers could afford the groceries, and others would go ahead and volunteer to pay for those groceries. Sitting at my dining room table and cleaning my kitchen, I made some of the most important friends of my life. Why am I here now at all? What you think is true. The research shows that everyone in this room is living in the loneliest era of American history. as far back as the research goes. And it's probably the loneliest era of people's history, but the research doesn't go back that far. And that's probably not a shock to anybody here. Just to ground that in some statistics, we've been on a slide of loneliness that certainly started at least in the 90s and has degraded. Right now, the loneliest generation of our era are 18 to 24-year-olds. And that is startling because up until this time, the correct assumption was the loneliest generation of any era were the most elderly because of their friends dying and immobility. That is no longer true. Or said differently, we as Americans are not learning the skills we need to create the connections that we need and want to have the lives that we seek. Another statistic, our networks have decreased by 1/3, and this does, in fact, account for social media. I'll tell you now, social media is fantastic at connecting us to people who don't care about us. And it's lousy, that's right. Some of you may later Google me and you'll find out I'm not on any social media, and the reason is because research is clear, it makes your life worse. I'm not on social media. My life is fantastic. And we know that the research shows that as we have friends or connections on social media, it actually doesn't make our lives better. Whereas if we make a single-digit number of friends in our real lives, our lives become much, much better. The number of confidence Americans have has decreased dramatically, and I'll just tell you a research. Half of Americans do not have 4 friends. I didn't say 4 friends at work or 4 friends at school or 4 friends at church. Half Americans do not have 4 friends. And that sounds bad, but it's actually much worse. 1 out of 6 Americans, 13%, have no friends. And so it's 13% for the general population. It's 15% of men. So it's half Americans have 3 friends or less. And the reason I'm grounding us in this is I want you to understand that while we're broaching the subject of connection this time, I want you to understand that we are all surrounded by people who want us to get better at connecting to the people we care about. And I have a 5-year-old son, and I'm aware that if I just trust him to learn these skills in the world, he's not going to learn them. That's at stake. And then here's the slide for those of you who want to hear that business people care about this. Vivek Murthy, our current Surgeon General, this year has been on media tour, naming loneliness epidemic his office's #1 priority. And well before he wrote a whole book on the subject, HBS published an article because they thought this was important for all businesses everywhere. When I talk about community, I'm talking about something very, very specific. I'm talking about a group of people who share mutual concern for one another. That's it. And at this point in my life, I'm only working with people in leadership roles, both formal and informal. And we talk about leadership and community building. All we're talking about is how we are facilitating the network of relationships of mutual concern. That's all we're talking about. I noticed that we're in an era where a group of people, many of whom call themselves marketers, not all marketers do this, many people who call themselves marketers do this, have learned that we're in a lonely time and we're desperate for more connection. And so they call things communities and brag about them, and they're not. They're often just lists. If you have 1,000 people in an auditorium, that is not a community, that is an audience. If you set up a pizza pop-up and people buy pizza from you, that is not a pizza community, those are customers. You get the idea. And I want to inoculate you right now from the people who would tell you they're really good about building community and brag about how quickly they do that and how big they do that, and they don't have a community, they have a list of emails. If I logged on to the Department of Motor Vehicles this year, I am not part of the Department of Motor Vehicles community. That's a list. So I want to inoculate from that. And so I've noticed in this lonely era, there's at least 2 strategies of community building being talked about. and I want to distinguish between the two. The first one is what we're going to talk about today. Communities where when people participate and we're done, they leave healthier, more resilient, and they're contributing and feel contributed to. And my guess is that's probably one of the reasons you showed up here today, is you think that's going to happen. The alternative are people who say they're building community, but overwhelmingly, if not exclusively, what they really want from you is your time, attention, and almost always your money. And they say they're building community, but they're really just trying to get something from you. And I want, from this moment forward, for you to recognize what's going on there, and that is not what's going to address this crisis of loneliness that we're all living with and all the people we care about. So the distinction that I'm going to share with you that if you use the rest of your lives will obliterate loneliness wherever you go is the distinction invitation. In my work, an invitation is a request to spend time where someone knows that someone else cares if they show up. I'm going to say it again. It's a request to spend time where someone knows that someone cares if they show up. If no one knows, if anyone cares if they show up, that's called an announcement. I share this because earlier in our time together, I talked about the fact that we're living in the loneliest era of American history. And that could bring some of us down. But when I think about that, I want you to be reminded of the wisdom that my grandparents left me. And that is if we take one simple, seemingly innocuous act over and over and over again, honest to goodness, we don't know what will be different in one generation. I'm aware that if those hands every week didn't put something in that first jar, I wouldn't be standing here today. That everything is different because of a small, seemingly innocuous act over and over again.